Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation. I'm Peter Staples at Lyon College in Batesville, Arkansas, United States. And Sajani Sharma will also be joining me in this presentation. We are going to have a discussion of the survival rates of benefit corporations. So some of the research questions we're going to discuss is, does having a social mission impact the prospects of a startup firm's survival and longevity? We could restate this as asking, do social entrepreneurs face a greater risk of failure than conventional entrepreneurs? We could also say or ask, is it feasible to balance achieving social impact goals with financial sustainability? We can use startup benefit corporations as a proxy for social venture startups. I did an original study in 2016 and looked at some of these elements. However, at the time, benefit corporations were very new. Also, one of the points of this study was to see if some of my original findings changed with the passage of time. We also added an additional dimension of longevity to our analysis.
So, benefit corporations are a relatively new form of business organizations. They are designed to create positive social or environmental outcomes while still operating as for profit entities. Advocates believe these forms can help support economic and community development and fill social needs in areas where markets underprovide. However, for that to be true, they must first survive in the marketplace because firm startup failure rates are high. We wanted to explore whether benefit corporations fail at different rates than traditional firms. The first benefit corporation law was enacted in Maryland in 2010. Since then, the idea has spread quickly. By 2022, 37 states and the District of Columbia had passed similar laws, and a few more were considering legislation. The laws share several features. A benefit corporation must pursue at least one public benefit. It must evaluate its performance against an outside standard, and in most states, it must publish an annual benefit report. This legal form also intended to protect founders and directors who want to consider social goals along with profit without fear of being sued for neglecting shareholder value. There are several reasons a company might choose to organize as a benefit corporation. It allows firms to lock in a social or environmental mission. It protects directors who also take non-financial interest into account. It can appeal to into account. It can appeal to investors and customers who prefer socially responsible businesses. There are also possible operational advantages. Employees who are motivated by a social mission may be more engaged and productive, which can help improve efficiency. The model legislation written by a nonprofit BLAV identifies seven categories of specific public benefits. These include serving low income or undeserved communities, promoting economic opportunity, protecting the environment, improving health, supporting the arts and sciences, increasing access to capital for socially beneficial enterprises, and creating any other substantial social or environmental benefit. Recent research shows high levels of mistrust for businesses and the capitalist economic system. Especially among younger people, some view benefit corporations as a part of larger social movement to bring transparency and accountability to businesses and markets and to consider broader stakeholder interests. Some well known companies have opted to organize or reorganize as benefit corporations. Here are the few examples.
I will now discuss some factors that could impact the survivability of benefit corporations. First, I'll briefly discuss benefits and positive externalities. So the public benefits, as discussed in the statutes, could be interpreted as positive externalities. So benefits accrue to a third party not directly involved in the transaction. Economic theory suggests that producing positive externalities tend to produce that firms that produce positive externalities tend to produce less than the socially optimal amount because they're not fully compensated for the benefits they create. This means that benefit corporations may face higher costs without receiving enough financial return to offset them. However, benefit corporations could also provide positive impact for society by filling social needs where markets fail. There are some factors that point to increased or favorable conditions to help increase the survivability rate of benefit corporations. So some of the reasons may be that they attract more loyal and productive workers and suppliers, thus decreasing the risk of failure. Also, they could attract more loyal customers, and this could decrease the price elasticity of demand, which increases the premium customers are willing to pay for the product. This would increase the survivability by decreasing financial risk. Socially investors may also be willing to accept lower than market returns, which could increase investment and decrease financial risk. Creation of positive externalities could improve public opinion of the firm, decreasing the risk of failure. Also, focus on long-term viability and social mission versus short-term profit maximization could decrease the risk of failure. And finally, government policy promoting benefit corporations could decrease the risk of failure, although there's currently limited evidence to support that this policy exists. Here are some factors that tend to argue against the survival rates of benefit corporations. In other words, they have a negative impact on their survivability. So first could be uncompensated additional costs incurred in producing public benefits may increase financial risk. Also, the complexity involved in the management of a double bottom line may increase the risk of failure. Foregone profits in pursuit of social goods may reduce, or social goals may reduce the amount of funds available to reinvest into the firm. Also, investor concerns because of non-exclusive focus on profit maximization could decrease investment capital, thus increasing the risk of failure. Public cynicism or greenwashing could increase the risk of failure through negative public opinion. And then finally, perception of benefit corporations as competition to nonprofits or NGOs could cause impediments to the survival of benefit corporations. It's difficult to quantify the magnitude of the impacts of the negative and positive factors weighing on the survivability of benefit corporations. So for the sake of study, we are just hypothesizing that benefit corporations are no more prone to failure than conventional corporations.
So, how did we test this idea? To test this idea, we collected data on all benefit corporations formed in California during 2012 and 2013, and a random sample of conventional corporations formed in the same time period. We treated active status in state businesses records as a sign of survival and any other status as a sign of failure because the firm is no longer legally in operation. We also recorded the dates that firms filed their articles of organization and the date they went inactive if status was not active. Our source was the California Secretary of State Office. California benefit corporations were chosen as research subjects for several reasons. Early adoption of benefit corporations provided a longer timeline for study. California's large population should have more benefit corporation startups forms than states with lower population. Another focus on a single state removes noise from differences in state statutory language and other potentially confounding factors.
For the data analysis, we used a two-proportion test to compare the survival rates of benefit corporations versus a random sample of conventional corporations that were started in 2012 and 2013. From the earlier study, we had the data for the status in 2016, but then we updated that by collecting data from 2025. We also broke out some of the data because the original data contained companies that were benefit corporations, but they were existing firms that amended their articles of organization to become benefit corporations. So that could have had an impact on the data because they weren't true startup firms. We also reran the data with a few questionable data points removed. For example, some firms had a zero duration. In other words, the formation day and the end date was the same. And then there were some firms that had a merged out status. So we thought if a firm merged, that isn't necessarily a failure. And if a firm had zero duration, it probably wasn't an operational issue for the failure. Maybe it was some sort of administrative issue. So we compared the success rates of the different groups. So first of all, we looked at all benefit corporations formed in 2012 in California versus the random sample of startup conventional corporations. And then we deleted the amended benefit corporations, in other words, the existing firms that converted to benefit corporations. So we were just comparing startup with startup in 2012. Then we did the same thing in 2013. And then we combined both years, 2012 and 2013, and did a similar analysis. Finally, we looked at 2012 startup benefit corporations versus 2013 startup benefit corporations, just to see if maybe there is a startup effect of the new statute being maybe unclear, causing earlier startups to have a higher failure rate. And finally, we took the existing firms that amended their articles to become benefit corporations in 2012 and 2013 and compared them with the startups for conventional corporations. Now, this isn't a straight comparison, but I'll explain the reasons we did that later. The other dimension we added to this study is we looked at the durations. So we collected data on when the firm was organized and when the firm ceased to have active status. We converted the durations into days and looked at the durations. So we looked at the distributions, we calculated the descriptive statistics, and we did this for both the 2012 and 2013 startup benefit corporations and the conventional corporations. And then finally, we ran a two-sample Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to determine whether the distribution of benefit corporation startups differed from that of conventional startups. And here we used the null hypothesis of no difference in distribution. So here are the results of the quantitative analysis of our test of two proportions. A lot of numbers on the screen, but just to show it, most of the p-values we calculated had no significant difference. There was one weak significance in 2012 from the 2016 data. And then we reran the analysis by taking the merged out and the zero duration data points out of the equation so that those weren't considered. And then finally, we ran the test of two proportions comparing the amended benefit corporations with the conventional startups. And there we found a very highly significant difference. So the proportion of success was almost 75% for the existing firms that converted to benefit corporations, while it was less than 25% for the conventional startups. And that was combined years 2012 and 2013. So the highlights of the two proportions test is there's no strong evidence that category sample means come from different populations. So in other words, we failed to reject the null hypothesis for all of the comparisons. There was some weak evidence that there were higher failure rates of 2012 benefit corporation startups compared to conventional corporations in the 2016 study, but that even that weak evidence disappeared in the 2025 study. And then when we removed the questionable data points, there was a minor impact on the p-value, so it didn't change any of the conclusions. And then as you saw, the established companies that converted to benefit corporations had a much lower failure rates than the startups of either category. For the duration study, we plotted the distribution. So here's the data distribution of the benefit corporations, and this is combined for 2012 and 2013. So again, it was the day they were organized to the day that they went inactive in their status. And then if we looked at conventional corporations, we see a similar distribution, and there's some statistics at the bottom. And then here's a snapshot of a side-by-side comparison. So we can see that the mean distribution, or the mean duration, is slightly higher for conventional corporations, but the median duration is very close, and the shapes are quite similar. And when we ran the two-sample Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, we were not significant in our results. In other words, we failed to reject the null hypothesis that the duration data came from different populations. So I mentioned earlier, the mean duration, fairly close, a little bit different. The median is very close, but again, the bottom line with the two sample test is there's not enough evidence to say that these distributions are significantly different. In other words, they came from similar populations. So if we look at the key findings and implications, the analysis indicates that benefit corporations are not more likely to fail than conventional corporations. And if we look at the duration data, it indicates that benefit corporations are not more likely to fail faster than conventional corporations. So the findings above provide some evidence that social entrepreneurs can balance social mission with financial sustainability. And then looking at the data for the firms, the existing firms that converted to benefit corporations, showing that that is significantly lower. It's not an apples to apples comparison, but their relatively high survival rate could be an indication that survival is not necessarily impeded by having a social mission. Some of the other things we ran across in our research that could be interesting is, first of all, information on benefit corporations is often not easy to obtain, both for entrepreneurs and investors, and they're not widely promoted by most states. We also found when looking for reports that many benefit corporations are not in compliance with statutory reporting requirements. Benefit corporations often contribute substantial proportions of or portions of their profits to social causes, and some are actually structured that way. They have a complementary nonprofit, and they use their profits to fund the nonprofit organization. Also, many benefit corporations provide pro bono services, and some of them pay above market wages. So for further study, we could verify that the findings are generalizable, or maybe they're just specific to California. Now that there's more data available that benefit corporations have been in existence for a longer period of time, we could look at other years to see if we can replicate the findings of the study. And we could also look at other forms of social enterprises to replicate the study. We could also attempt to differentiate different types of benefit corporations. For example, we could look at industry categorization, or we could look at their stated category of public benefit in their articles of organization to see if that makes a difference in the survivability. Also, we could dive deeper into defining success. So we had a fairly high level definition of success, just whether or not the firm was still in operation, but we did not have data on specific financial performance or social and economic impact. So we could look at things like that. We could also try and quantify and validate the impact of factors enhancing or impeding the success of benefit corporations that we discussed earlier. If we could do this, then benefit corporations could actually use this information to develop strategies to exploit or mitigate high impact factors. And then we could look at the actual causes of failure of the corporations. So thank you for taking time to watch. If you want to have further discussion, I've posted my email and be happy to talk more about it. Thank you.